The restaurant was warm that evening, glowing with the quiet hum of conversations, the clink of silverware, and the faint sound of jazz pouring softly through the speakers. It was one of those old-style Southern diners, red leather booths, framed pictures of smiling customers from decades past, and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years, the kind of place where regulars felt at home and newcomers felt like they were stepping into someone else's story. James Carter, a tall black man with a steady presence, walked in with the calm stride of someone who had carried weight far heavier than most could imagine. His shoulders bore the quiet discipline of a soldier, though his uniform had long been folded away. James was a veteran of 2 wars, a man who had traveled oceans, lived in deserts, and faced battlefields where survival was never promised. Yet here, in his own hometown, he still walked into rooms with a certain guardedness, like he was waiting for something to test him. That evening, he just wanted a steak, nothing fancy. Just a hot meal after a long day of working with his hands at a local garage, fixing engines and earning an honest living. He slid into a booth near the window, his deep brown eyes glancing at the menu, though he already knew what he would order. Steak, medium rare, mashed potatoes on the side, a simple comfort. The waitress approached with a practiced smile. She was young, maybe mid-20s, blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, her apron smudged faintly from a busy shift. Her smile faltered for half a second when she saw him, but then she caught herself, pasted it back on, and asked in a chirpy voice, "What can I get for you tonight, sir?" James looked up at her, his voice calm, polite. "Steak, medium rare, potatoes on the side, and a glass of water, please." She scribbled quickly, nodded, and walked away. He didn't think much of it. He had learned not to, but there was something in the way her eyes lingered on him, something in the subtle tension of her smile that stirred the quiet instinct he had carried from the battlefield, the one that told him when danger was near, when words had hidden meaning. Minutes passed. The steak arrived, hot, sizzling, the scent rich and savory, the kind of meal that could settle the body and ease a man's thoughts. James cut into it slowly, savoring the first bite, letting the flavors remind him that there was still joy in small things. But as he chewed, he felt eyes on him. Glances that slipped across the room like shadows, from the counter, from a corner booth, from 2 men who had paused mid-conversation just long enough to make their attention clear. The waitress came back, topping off his water, though the glass was hardly touched. She leaned in, as though adjusting the plate, and in the quietest whisper, so low he almost missed it, she said, "Don't stay too long. They're watching you." James froze. The fork in his hand hovered above the plate, his chest tightening with the weight of her words. She straightened quickly, her smile plastered back on as if nothing had been said. But her eyes, the flicker in them, confirmed it wasn't a mistake. For a moment, James was no longer in that diner. He was back in the desert, in the Middle East, where whispers meant survival and silence meant death. He remembered the brief warnings shared among soldiers before an ambush. He remembered the coded glances, the silent urgency of danger close at hand. His body tensed the same way now, though this was no battlefield. This was home. But home was complicated for a black man like James. He had left his blood in foreign soil fighting for a flag that did not always fight for him. He had carried comrades out of fire, only to return and be denied a handshake from the very neighbors who claimed to love their country. He had survived bullets overseas, but here, back in his own hometown, it was suspicion, prejudice, and hate that followed him like shadows. He lowered his fork slowly, his mind steady but alert. He did not look around right away. He had learned long ago never to show fear too soon. Instead, he lifted his glass, took a sip of water, and let his gaze wander casually across the room. The 2 men in the corner booth were still watching. One leaned in, muttering something the other found amusing. A chuckle that carried no humor. At the counter, an older man shifted in his seat, his stare deliberate, the kind that wasn't yelled about curiosity but about claim, like James's presence was an intrusion into a space not meant for him. James felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, the years of service, the sacrifices, the dignity he had fought to maintain even when the world seemed bent on stripping it away. And now, here he was, in a diner where all he wanted was a steak, being reminded once again that peace was something he had to fight for, even at home. The waitress returned a few minutes later, moving quickly, her face calm but her steps hurried. She leaned slightly as if to clear a dish, whispering again without breaking her smile. "They've been asking about you. Just finish and go." Her voice trembled, but only slightly, enough for James to know this was no joke, no paranoia. She was warning him, risking herself by doing it. In that moment, he saw more than a waitress. He saw a young woman who recognized danger and chose courage over silence. James nodded faintly, his voice low but steady. "Thank you." She gave the smallest tilt of her head, then walked away, never breaking the mask of routine service. Every bite of steak after that tasted different. Not because of the food, but because of the tension that thickened the air around him. He chewed slowly, each swallow a deliberate choice to remain calm, to remain present. He knew the rules. He had lived them all his life. Don't give them reason. Don't show anger. Don't lose your cool. His dignity was his armor, and tonight, he needed it more than ever. The room felt smaller. The jazz on the speakers sounded thinner. He could sense the hostility pulsing around him, quiet, but deliberate. James thought of the flag he had saluted so many times. He thought of the oath he had taken to defend his country. He thought of the men he had carried home, folded in flags, buried with honor. And he thought of the irony, that the same man who had stared down enemies overseas was now treated as an enemy in his own hometown, in a diner, over a plate of steak. He placed his fork down slowly, wiped his mouth with the napkin, and prepared to stand. But before he did, he looked once more at the waitress. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment, he saw both fear and resolve. She had given him a choice: stay and risk what might come, or leave with his dignity intact. James Carter had fought enough wars to know that not every battle was worth blood. Some were won in silence, in choosing to walk away with your head high, even when the world tried to bow it low. He rose, tall and unshaken, every inch the soldier he had always been. The room grew quieter as he reached for his wallet, placed a folded bill on the table, and looked once more toward the corner booth. The men's smirks faltered when they saw the steel in his eyes, not of fear, but of a man who had faced death before and refused to bow to hate. And in that silence, the diner seemed to hold its breath. James turned toward the door, his steps measured, deliberate, carrying the unspoken weight of a man who had learned that sometimes survival was its own kind of victory. His boots pressed against the checkered floor, the sound steady and unbroken. He didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't let his shoulders betray the storm inside. He knew they were watching him, the men at the booth, the man at the counter, maybe others too. But James Carter had lived through darker nights and more dangerous eyes. As he reached the door, he felt the same quiet echo of memory he often carried. The transport plane leaving the desert, the silence after gunfire, the long drive back into his hometown where flags waved for the 4th of July, but neighbors averted their gaze when he walked by. He knew what it was to be celebrated abroad and dismissed at home, and still, he carried himself with the quiet nobility of someone who had nothing to prove, because his life, his service, his sacrifices were already proof enough. The waitress, still balancing trays and masking her nerves with smiles, glanced at him as he passed. For a brief second, her mask slipped, and he saw relief in her face, relief that he had heard her warning, relief that he was leaving before the storm broke. He gave her the smallest nod, one soldier to another, though she had never worn a uniform. She had chosen courage in her own way, and that mattered. Outside, the cool night air met him like a balm. The stars were scattered across the sky, indifferent to the struggles below. He breathed deeply, steadying himself. The street was quiet, but he knew that leaving the diner didn't mean the danger had ended. Hatred had a way of following men like him, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an excuse to strike. James walked slowly toward his truck parked under a street lamp. Each step felt heavier than the last. He thought about the men inside, the ones who had smirked, the ones who had watched him like a target. He knew men like that. He had seen them in his youth, heard their jeers on the street corners, felt the sting of their suspicion when he tried to rent an apartment, apply for a job, or simply walk into a store. He had seen them dressed as sheriffs and bosses, neighbors and so-called friends. Some wore uniforms of authority, others wore the disguise of ordinary life. But their gaze was always the same, a warning that dignity would not come without resistance. As he reached his truck, he opened the door slowly, scanning the street out of habit. His instincts were not paranoia. They had been earned. He climbed inside, placed his hands on the wheel, and sat there for a moment, letting the engine idle. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass, lined with years of service, resilience, and battles that most people would never see. For a moment, James considered driving straight home, locking the door and letting the night pass. But as the engine purred, he thought of his father, another black man who had once been warned to leave places quietly, who had been told with unspoken words where he did not belong. He thought of his grandfather, who had carried himself tall even when laws were written to keep him low. And he thought of his own son, now grown, who would inherit the same world that still measured a black man's worth not by his sacrifices, but by the color of his skin. James pressed his hands tighter against the wheel. Running was not his way. Survival was necessary, but dignity was everything. He wasn't going to let them decide his place. Not tonight. So instead of pulling away, he turned off the engine. He stepped out of the truck, the cool night air sharp against his face, and stood beneath the street lamp. He wasn't going back into the diner. No. That battle wasn't worth the blood. But he also wasn't going to slink into the shadows, carrying their unspoken victory. He stood there, tall and still, like a sentinel. Through the diner's window, the men inside noticed. Their laughter grew quieter. Their eyes flickered toward him, uncertain now. They had expected fear. They had expected avoidance. But what they saw was a man who refused to bend, a man who carried himself with the unyielding calm of someone who had walked through fire and come out whole. The waitress glanced out too, just briefly, her eyes widening. She understood what he was doing, and in her gaze, James saw something like gratitude, not just for listening to her warning, but for showing her too that silence was not the only response to intimidation. Minutes passed. James didn't move. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't so much as lift a finger. His presence was enough. His stillness spoke louder than rage ever could. It was a reminder that strength doesn't always need to swing a fist. Sometimes it only needs to stand unshaken. Eventually, the men inside broke. One by one, their stares faltered. The laughter stopped. The tension they had built in their little booth dissolved into restless shifting, eyes turning down toward half-eaten plates. Hate is loud when it believes it's unchallenged, but when faced with quiet, unwavering dignity, it often crumbles into silence. After a while, James turned back to his truck. He climbed in again, started the engine, and this time he drove away. Not as a man who had been chased out, but as a man who had chosen his own exit. The road stretched ahead, dark and long, but James felt no defeat. He had not stayed for the stake. He had not stayed for pride in the shallow sense. He had stayed for something deeper, for the principle that no one, no matter their smirks or stares, had the right to tell him where he belonged. When he pulled into his driveway that night, the house stood quiet, the porch light glowing softly against the dark. He sat for a moment before going inside, thinking again of the waitress. Her whisper had stopped him cold, not because it made him afraid, but because it reminded him of something he sometimes forgot, that even in the midst of hate, there are those willing to risk a moment of courage. She didn't know him. She didn't owe him anything, but she chose to speak. And sometimes the smallest act of courage is enough to change the outcome of an entire night. James stepped inside his home, removed his boots, and sat down at the table, the silence wrapping around him. He thought about the wars he had fought, the battles he had survived, and the quiet war that still raged here, in places as ordinary as diners and street corners. He knew it wasn't over, not for him, not for his son, not for the countless others who bore the same weight. But he also knew this: he would not stop standing. He would not stop carrying himself with the quiet strength of a man who refused to bow. Because dignity, once earned, cannot be stolen. And somewhere, back in that diner, a young waitress would remember the black veteran who ordered a steak, who listened to her whisper, and who walked out not as a man defeated, but as a man unbroken. And maybe, just maybe, her courage that night would grow into something larger, the kind of seed that spreads, that reminds others that silence helps no one, that even whispers can hold power. James Carter slept that night with the calm of a man who had faced danger once more and had lived, not just survived, but lived with dignity intact. And as the stars shone above his hometown, the story of that evening quietly etched itself into the unspoken history of Black resilience, a story of service, of injustice, of warning, of courage, and of a man who would not let hate decide his place at the table. Because sometimes the most powerful battles are not fought with weapons or words, but with the unbreakable decision to stand, to endure, and to leave the world no choice but to see your worth.